We're a few days away from the crucial EU summit on the future of the European economy, the future of the Eurozone. And with me here is Sony Kapoor, the managing director of the think tank Redefine. Sony, what is it exactly your think tank does?
We advise governments and civil society organizations on financial reform, economic policy, and also a bit on development and environment.
Now, one important piece of advice that you've given to the EU institutions in 2010, I think it was the creation of the European Finance and Stability Facility, the EFSF. Basically, a way to rescue ailing economies in the European Union. Very briefly, how did that initially work?
Well, we did not actually work on the design of the EFSF, but we worked on improving the design. And the basic idea is that if the EFSF, instead of first borrowing from the markets and then lending to troubled economies, which means that it takes time, there's a transaction cost, and these economies such as Greece and Ireland, etc., are now shut out of the markets. So instead of doing that, what we suggested was that the EFSF should start issuing guarantees on the borrowing of countries that were in financial trouble. So in a way, this would provide credit enhancement and improve the quality of the borrowing, and these countries could continue to access the markets. Now, in January this year, when it was realized the EFSF was not big enough and it needed to be expanded in size, but there was no political will for putting more money in, what we suggested was, instead of fully guaranteeing bond issuance by troubled economies, even if the EFSF offered partial guarantees, say only against the first third of losses, that should also send the appropriate political signal that the EU, the Euro area, 17 countries thought that the economy of this country was going to improve, that these countries were solvent and would not default on their debt. And this would be a way of increasing confidence and lowering borrowing costs. So that is what is being discussed now.
We're talking about the potential default in Greece. Some people would say, well, then this EFSF, this rescue plan for Greece, at least has failed.
Well, the EFSF was never lending to Greece, and we made sure when we made the recommendation to only suggest that it be applicable to countries that were not Greece, because Greece was insolvent from the start, and it was very clear. And in fact, the reason for EU policymakers to be having these discussions now is they failed to make the distinction at the beginning between an insolvent country such as Greece and other countries such as Ireland and Italy and Spain, which were only facing temporary problems, but for which in all likelihood every 100 cents on every euro of borrowed money would be paid back.
The EFSF initially had 440 billion euros in it. Forgive me for making this comparison, but I'm trying to make this make sense. If this is a bucket full of water to put out a fire, and a full bucket is 440 billion, we have 300 billion left at the moment to work with. That's clearly not enough to deal with the potential fire in Italy and or Spain. But yet, the way what I'm understanding from you and other economists is that this 300 billion is going to be tripled or quadrupled by the EU leaders, who are saying simply simsalabim. We have one bucket, we double it or we quadruple it to sort out the problem. Is that a fair comparison?
Yes and no. So one way of thinking about this is the initial plan was that the EFSF was only going to make relatively safe loans to troubled countries. And you know that loans are safer than shares, bonds are safer than shares. And now a new way of thinking about this is, instead of the EFSF money, which has stayed the same, being in the form of safe loans, you are taking on more risk. So in that sense, you can make that same amount of money go further. What has increased is not the headline amount of money. What has increased is the risk that you're willing to take with it. And that's the trick behind the leverage.
So leverage sounds very much like a derivative, one of these words that have popped up in financial engineering that are basically at the root of this crisis. Is that's very difficult for people to understand. It's even difficult for me to understand. So leveraging is going to be the way to solve the crisis at the moment.
Well, that's a half-fair comparison. A better comparison is insurance, which most people are familiar with. Now, imagine that you are ill, or you think you're going to fall ill, and you buy an insurance policy in order to be able to make your loan repayments if and when you do fall ill. And the insurance policy often does not cover the full amount of payment, but contributes a substantial amount. So that's what we're thinking about. Italy and Spain are a bit ill, and the EFSF will sell them insurance, but not for the full amount of the money that they need, but for a relatively small amount. And this means that rather than the situation where, because they're a little bit ill, they will be fired from the markets, in a manner of speaking, they can continue to work, continue to access the market at reasonable borrowing costs, with some of the risk being taken on by the EFSF. What is important about this is not to think of this in terms of a financial guarantee, but much more that this is a political signal. This is a political signal that 17 euro area member states are sending to the markets, that they believe that lending to Italy and Spain is safe, and hence, because they believe that, they are willing to put themselves in harm's way between bondholders facing any losses and Italy and Spain. And this is a sign of confidence. And if this is sold as a political signal more than as a CDO or a tricky financial tool, which will not be believed, then as a political signal, I think this has some good potential, but it would probably need additional support from the European Central Bank. It's, I think, necessary, but since July, when the crisis has become systemic, this particular proposal is probably no longer sufficient. ECB help will still be required.
So clearly we are expecting a big political signal before the markets open on Monday after the summit. But if you look at this system, some people are saying this is also something that will buy time for 1 to 2 years. Is this not then the final end-it-all solution that everybody says we really need?
The final end-it-all solution was never going to come in such a short time. What happened last year when the Greek problems were first revealed was that the economic problems were rather limited and the political space to handle them was quite substantial. But having failed to sort out Greece over a period of 18 months, you cannot realistically expect anybody to have confidence in these same policymakers to sort out the much bigger problems now that confront us in Italy and Spain in a much shorter period of time. So I think what we will only see is, yes, buying more time, which does allow you to make the kind of structural reforms and changes that can enhance credibility of individual member states, such as Italy and Spain. But that time is crucially needed. Without that time, we are all going down the pot.
Okay, Sony, thanks very much. Before that time actually ends, I'm sure we'll talk to you again. Thanks very much for watching. Stay tuned also on the EUX.tv channel. We're planning a live broadcast from the EU Summit here in Brussels at 4 o'clock on Sunday afternoon. You can check our Facebook page for exact timings. Thanks very much.